Good afternoon. I want to welcome you all to ESG Opportunity or Minefield. Is your company getting it right? We will be recording this session. In the hour or so that we have available, we're going to provide some background, definitions, and perspective that we hope will help you to navigate the ESG landscape and be able to focus on what will make the greatest difference for your company, and learn from some experts who have been working at this for a while now across a variety of organizations. At the conclusion of our discussion, we will be answering your questions. You can submit those through the question tab at the right hand of your screen. So what is ESG, and how can this lens for risk, opportunity, and culture benefit your company and your stakeholders? So the E refers to how a company manages its environmental impact. For some, this is obvious, for others, not so much. As are your practices, products, and supply chain sustainable? We know BlackRock, for example, and some of the other major institutional investors have become extremely focused on climate change. The S stands for social impact. How do you make the world a better place? It turns out not only the millennials care about this. Profits matter, but now your customers, investors, and even some regulators are looking more closely at how you're achieving your success. This ranges from creating metrics for improving DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to how people are compensated and how your company may choose to leverage your brand for social impact. Finally, the G is for governance. How does management and the board address different stakeholder interests? Is there alignment? Who's being included in the decision-making? Is there transparency and accountability? Do we have the right people, systems, and culture in place to support effective leadership in the organization? When the four of us began having discussions around this topic, we knew we came at it from very different perspectives. So I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and tell you why ESG has become an important area of focus for them. Let's start with Barbara, to be followed by Pam and Betsy.
Thanks, Karen. My name is Barbara Kremsick. I spent a 40-year career in investment management, the first 23 years with AllianceBernstein in New York, and importantly, the last 17 as CEO of Calvert Investments. And that name may resonate with some of you. Calvert was one of the earliest investors in what was then called SRI, Socially Responsible Investing, or Corporate Social Responsibility, now called ESG or Sustainability, and all these terms have a lot of overlap. My transition from a firm that was not involved in ESG type investing to Calvert was a bit of an aha moment, and explains why I'm so interested now. In 1997, which is now very long ago, I was approached about becoming the CEO of Calvert, and as a mathematician had to quickly decipher what was going on with sustainable investing. I certainly understood the financial markets and financial drivers of investment performance, but I found myself increasingly believing that some of what were then called non-financial indicators were terribly important to the performance of a company over time, more about the long-range performance versus the trading range or the day-to-day performance. And I believed then that the analytics behind sustainability and behind ESG were actually material to the performance of a company. So that began my journey, which was for the rest of my career, and now almost 20 years ago, or over 20 years ago, on the ESG path. Now I serve as a board member on a number of corporate, foundation, and nonprofit boards, and bring this perspective of ESG to my service as a board member.
Thanks, Barbara. Pam?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Pam Perozek, and I have a legal, accounting, and regulatory background, and I am a managing director at Kroll, where I lead our financial investigations practice. Previously, I served in the enforcement division of the SEC. I've worked in Big Four accounting as a forensic partner, and also have served as a compliance advisor for a number of regulated entities and multilateral organizations. The reason ESG is so important to us is that we just have unprecedented demand, from our clients for ESG services. We closely follow, we closely track regulatory developments, SEC initiatives in particular. And because there's such a huge focus on ESG today in the regulatory context, in both our due diligence work and our regulatory compliance assignments, this is an important trend that we've been following, and we have been helping our clients worldwide to provide ESG-related solutions.
Thank you, Pam. Betsy?
Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I'm Betsy Blumenthal, and I'm managing director and run the non-cyber investigations team on the West Coast for Kroll. And I've come up over the years with doing hundreds, if not thousands, of what we call background checks, due diligence on executives, management teams for PE firms, corporate M&A. In the last few years, we've recognized that on a parallel track, what's really important is to also get some intelligence on the culture of a company. And so the water cooler chatter, what are people saying? And for many of these high profile, matters, or companies that have had issues, we recognize that it's very, very important to get the complementary intelligence on the company and what's really going on that can affect their bottom line.
Thanks, Betsy. And I'm your moderator, Karen Kasaba Edwards. I'm a managing partner with Boyden. And as an executive recruiter, I'm assessing culture all the time in my clients' organizations and in the different companies where we may be sourcing candidates. As a CFA and a former investment banker and board member, I'm always interested in what creates value in companies over time. Culture is often the key to making a good acquisition. That's true in M&A, and it's true in executive recruiting. People are holding out for that elusive fit. And in a hyper-competitive market for talent like we have now, we see candidates making assessments that include a lot of the components of ESG. It's really a lens for them to manage their own risk and weigh the opportunity as they're considering whether or not to join your organization. So we'd like to get a sense of our audience today, and there are several hundred of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And we have several poll questions, and we'll ask you to vote. It should come up on your screen. So here's our first poll. Has your company made voluntary commitments to achieving improvements in environmental, social, or governance performance? Yes or no? And we'll give you a few seconds here. Okay, we can close the poll. And yes, most of you have. Wonderful. All right, let's go on to the second question. Does your company report or publish sustainability or ESG data via a sustainability report or some kind of disclosure in regulatory filings or communications to employees or any other means? Give you a couple seconds here. Okay, let's close the poll. All right, interesting. Sustainability reports. We've got a variety here. Only 12% communications to employees, other ways, and almost half of you, no, you're not reporting anything yet. Okay, that's interesting and very helpful for our panelists today. Okay, thank you. All right, I think that we'll get started. I have the first question for Barbara. Barbara, if you could just talk to us for a few minutes about why ESG is resonating today for managements, boards, and investors.
I would, in my 20 plus years in this field, it's been a hockey stick because for a very long time, it was considered more of a niche, interesting, but perhaps not important to every company. And now all of a sudden, probably the last five years in particular, it's just exploded in terms of concern and interest and focus. So I think that I noted 4 drivers that I think are really making this happen to the extent we see this trend accelerating. The first is that there's more research showing that in many cases there is a material effect on corporate performance based on ESG factors. NYU Stern School's done an excellent study of this, of all the studies of materiality and investment performance, and it's posted in the handouts that are available to every attendee. We know that the quality of ESG data is not always excellent and also not always comparable across companies and within industries. So there's a way to go. But the first driver is investment performance, which is often, the most critical, bottom line. Second, institutional investors are putting more pressure. I'm not sure I ever thought I'd see the day that ExxonMobil directors would lose 3 seats that management supported for election to their board, which happened this spring. And what drove that, and the reason the institutional investors are getting, they've always been interested, frankly, institutional investors, the California pension funds, New York pension funds, et cetera, have had a long interest in ESG performance at companies. But now we have the concentration of voting power in the hands, by and large, of the index funds for public companies. So the Larry Fink letter that was referenced by Karen that states some importance for the BlackRock organization of ESG, Vanguard, Fidelity, State Street, that if these entities, these institutional investors go into a vote viewing an issue the same way, they can largely influence the outcome. And indeed, they did support a small hedge fund that proposed 3 alternative directors. So institutional investors are putting increasing pressure on companies to address ESG risks and opportunities in their strategies. Third, the generational push for millennials and younger generations that are showing a tremendous interest in the companies that they work for, that they show a good social awareness. We heard the diversity, equity, and inclusion concerns, but also environmental concerns that are important to this generation. And this factors into their decisions on employment and whether or not they're going to stay with their companies. And ultimately, too, it's the customers and the external stakeholders that are concerned about this and the companies they do business with. And the last one, very importantly, and I know we'll talk more about this, is regulatory and government. There may well be more of it. There's certainly more in Europe in terms of guidelines and requirements for disclosures. And I just want to comment on that poll that we saw 82% of those participating say that their companies have made voluntary commitments, but 47% said they did not see reports on these. And I think that's where regulators are going to focus. They're going to focus on that gap between commitments and actual, what are you actually doing, or what have you actually done to achieve those commitments. So I think I would just lay those out, Karen, as sort of the big items that are driving this interest.
Thank you. Pam or Betsy, anything to add? Pam, you're on mute.
I think to comment just a little further on some of the comments Barbara made, agree 100% across the board. I think it's interesting that, right now in the United States, these disclosures are voluntary. For those who make disclosures, I think there will be additional scrutiny, and we're starting to see some guidance, from the SEC in particular on what that scrutiny will look like, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's not voluntary all over the world. In some places it is mandatory. But the big change here is that the standard setters are really pushing to develop and harmonize standards on ESG disclosures. And I think that's going to change, the dynamic here. We're also seeing a lot of pressure from proxy advisors. I think that they're adding a tremendous amount of pressures, especially around diversity and inclusion at the board level. ISS and Glass Lewis have been very active. NASDAQ has been active with respect to its listing standards and the types of directors they expect to have on boards, not only in 2021, but in 2022, and expected to see some diversity there as well. And then I think there's this other dynamic with just sort of the change in social values post-pandemic. And I think it's the convergence of all of these factors that have really put ESG in the spotlight today.
Yeah, and I would add, sitting out here in the Bay Area where there are so many privately held companies, some large, some small, that the chase for good talent is, to your world, Karen, is at the utmost of importance because it's a competitive world, and to attract and maintain the talent that you want, you really have to have a terrific culture these days. And whether it's Glassdoor or other sites that are, making information very available, it's incredibly important. And the bottom line, because we've seen companies that are household names that have suffered from boycotts and, attrition of talent and things of that sort. So it affects the privately held companies as well.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, you talked about institutional investors. How are they changing their approach to incorporate ESG?
Well, it's changed dramatically. Institutional investors often respond to asset owners and what they're looking for. And so it goes hand in hand that the institutional investors are both themselves recognizing that these are material factors to performance, but they're also being challenged to demonstrate how they are going about it. So asset owners are expecting that asset managers will incorporate ESG into their investment policies and practices. I do want to point out that this is not sort of a one-size-fits-all space. Every company has a relatively unique ESG profile in terms of what's material to that company. And there may be similarities within industries. I mean, extractive industries, of course, all have share, let's say, a very keen focus on environmental footprint. Tech companies more focused on privacy, cybersecurity, governance, risk management, workforce diversity. Manufacturers have supply chain, human rights issues. And institutional investors are getting more savvy about greenwashing. I mean, it's not, if you're not looking at the issues that are material to your particular company and industry, then that's not good enough. Making, affirmative comments about ESG, but not tackling the really big issues in your space, the elephant in the room in your company. And that's going to be relatively unique. There's not one template that's going to work for every company. And institutional investors are increasingly wielding the tools that they have. So stock selection is one, or asset management is one, but they have the advocacy tool. And increasingly, I mean, you are seeing companies, and I've just talked a little earlier about this, the index funds in particular, have this enormous voting power. And they are increasingly going in coalition with other investors and becoming more like activists, which didn't used to be the case. Used to be the activists were confined to maybe more the hedge funds and the corporate raiders or corporate activists, but they are really becoming much more involved because they can't really divest the index funds. They've got to own everything. So that's the tool they're going to use. So you're going to see a lot more shareholder activism in the ESG space. Lastly, the court of public opinion. We talked about this. It is increasingly important. Brand value and reputation are huge, and Betsy mentioned culture, and that institutional investors look at that too. That can really sink a company to lose its brand value, its credibility in the marketplace. And so institutional investors are on top of all of these trends, and we'll talk perhaps a little bit more about the signatory process for Principles for Responsible Investing. It's voluntary, but almost all asset managers have signed on to various principles that have to do with exploring ESG in their investment process.
So I hear you saying the pressure's on, but each industry and each company really is going to need to follow a very individualized blueprint. And so it looks like this is going to take significant time and effort inside these organizations. Pam, what's happening on the regulatory front? And, looking broadly, let's look not just the US, but globally. You're muted.
There's quite a lot happening on the regulatory front. And oftentimes what we see is that it is that regulatory initiative that tends to really drive change and help really free up the resources needed to make those necessary investments and to really, look hard at the organizational culture and look at the policies, procedures, controls in place. In terms of the current regulatory activity, the SEC just released its rulemaking agenda. I think it's significant for a couple of reasons. One, it contains ESG requirements for investment companies and investment advisors, as well as disclosure requirements for all SEC registrants relating to one, climate-related risks and opportunities, and then second, diversity of board members and nominees. So, this is still in development, it will be a little bit of time before that's formally implemented, but I think it's something important to pay attention to. I think we're getting a little bit of a sense of what some of this might look like through some of the releases on the Division of Enforcement's task force and on the Division of Examinations recent risk alert. So the SEC's task force on climate and ESG has announced that it will be proactively identifying ESG related misconduct, and that it will be using sophisticated data analysis, to mine and identify potential violations. Well, that's all very interesting. I think that we've sort of been scratching our heads saying, well, what does that mean? We know that these tools have been used historically in financial reporting fraud investigations. This is a little bit of a different application. They have the technology, of course, that they can look at disclosures, but I think that the risk alert that came out in April by the Division of Examinations really put some meat on that, specifically, and this goes to sort of the first phase, which is geared toward investment advisors and funds, that in their exams, they're looking specifically at the accuracy of disclosures around marketing claims and other public statements, whether they're in the annual reports or sustainability reports, in the public filings, wherever they come out, to make sure that they are in fact accurate and consistent and can be relied upon. Secondly, they're looking at the implementation of ESG policies and procedures, which they've said should be subject to compliance oversight. That's a little bit of a change. I'm not sure there has been a lot of compliance oversight to date, but that's something that I think is an important new fact. And thirdly, there's an expectation that there will be documentation around the ESG investment process, including, research, due diligence, selection and monitoring of ESG investments. So again, a lot of this is not mandatory yet, but for those companies who do make disclosures about ESG, there will be scrutiny, not only, in an exam, but there could be a referral to enforcement, there could be whistleblower complaints, and I think that there will be greater coordination just on the US side. In Europe, in other locations, there are some mandatory compliance, and we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about standard setting. But certainly, I think that there is a big push toward having more uniform disclosures, toward having more accountability, and to really providing a way for investors to really compare, ESG disclosures across industries, because there are disparate standards right now. You're not always comparing apples to apples, because there's just, there's a lot. You can choose, which reporting metrics you'll use, which standards you'll follow, and there isn't a lot of clear guidance right now.
Having said that, it sounds like this is not really something that companies can really assume they can push out for years or a decade. This is all coming pretty fast right now.
I think it's coming fast. The sense that we're getting, from the market is that there is increased emphasis on really starting to pay attention to what types of ESG, controls are in place. And And while it is still voluntary, I think everyone is expecting that this train has left the station and is moving fast, and people need to sort of get ahead of it and start putting the infrastructure in place to really, monitor the ESG disclosures and make sure that folks are complying.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the organization level. Barbara, can you share with us some things that boards are doing regarding ESG and culture, corporate culture assessment, and where does that responsibility lie? You're on mute.
Sorry. The role of the board is definitely moving into the forefront. I would say probably 5 to 10 years ago, it was not even on the radar. In my experience, the big wake up was on the social side 4 to 5 years ago with the Me Too movement and the unfolding of essentially corporate brand and reputation damage significant, whether it was CBS or the Weinstein companies, from the behaviors that were tolerated in the company. And that woke up, I know it woke up the boards I was on, not that we knew of any issues, but the sense that how does the board oversee culture? How does the board oversee ESG factors? And I know they're not identical in terms of what we're talking about, but they're very similar. In one of my roles, the board decided that we needed to actually take a proactive look at corporate culture, particularly the social side, and formed an ad hoc committee on board oversight of corporate culture and what that meant and what we thought we should be looking at and what we expected of management. There were very few resources even 5 years ago, but one of them was the NACD, which had a white paper on board oversight of corporate culture, which helped us. But again, you feel every company is different, every organization, every industry. And this happened to be in an industry that was predominantly male and therefore needed, a lot of focus at the board level regarding diversity, in particular on the gender side. So what the board did at the time, because there weren't that many resources available, is we did our own study and did not have a third-party entity. And I think I at the time said that's a great space that to be filled, which is to have third-party reviews. But we looked at mission, vision, values. We looked at how management was rewarded or not for achievement of ESG type goals, how communications were handled, how hotlines were handled, legal aspects in terms of whether or not the board was getting good insights into settlements, which was a big part of the opaqueness in these companies that lost their reputations and their a good deal of value at that time, because the board was simply not aware of so many things that were going on that would have been red flags. So we developed a list that we thought was useful to management, and they accepted it. They accepted virtually all the recommendations and have upgraded their reporting to us in this space. And one very strong outcome of that was to be sure that the CEO had as a very high level achievement and goal every year is the assessment of corporate culture and the achievement of a workplace that had a strong, positive, non-toxic culture, and that's number one for the last 4 years in the goals of the CEO. So even if you think you don't have problems, and even if a board feels there aren't problems, I think this is going to be more and more a board level concern as time goes on, because of the very dramatic repercussions, whether things evolve as Pam sees them evolving, with perhaps actually fines and repercussions at the regulatory level without solid performance on ESG. I think boards will put this more front and center in the coming years.
And do you think very many other organizations have made this kind of effort? You've been at it for 4 years now. I know you talk to people about this a lot. What's your sense out there anecdotally?
Well, from my experience, and I've done a couple of different, spoken at a few gatherings of board members and board organizations, and based on the number of people that want our study, which I can't share, but I can give the top line on it, I would say not a lot have actually done this. And I saw an interesting statistic in preparing for this event, which is that, again, it's an NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business report that says, that suggests that under 30% of Fortune 100 board members, and there are over 1,100 of them, have any relevant ESG credentials. And within that, only 6% have environmental experience. So I think things are going to happen in terms of the boards coming up to speed on educating themselves in these areas, and that will lead to more of the kinds of studies I was suggesting. Believe me, when I raised these issues at the board, it was fascinating to me because no one else had thought of, well, should we be looking at ourselves in this regard? We count on management to tell us, and we did, and we do have very transparent management, but still, this was not an area that was on the radar for transparency with boards. But yet when I raised it with management and with the board, the entire board wanted to participate in the ad hoc committee. We had to be careful. Ad hoc means a small number of people on a very short time frame. We gave ourselves a year to conduct this work, and then we sunset the committee. We feel it's a full board area of responsibility. It's not something that should be concentrated in a sustainability committee of the board or an ESG committee of the board. It's for the entire board to some issues fall under HR, some fall under audit and finance, some fall under let's see, what else do we have? Our systems, our operational committee, but it's a full board concern.
That's interesting that you mentioned HR, because we're only just beginning to see in board searches any sort of demand for that talent, which you would think might be front and center for a board. And maybe this is going to, provide some more demand for HR professionals, particularly those who sit in the C-suite and are more involved in strategy in addition to talent acquisition. Thank you. Okay, let's go to our third poll. This is our last question, and we're wondering in this poll, if we could put it up on the screen, has your company conducted any sort of third-party assessment or audit or assurance study of ESG sustainability data? Okay, let's close the poll. No, not yet. Okay, so that's most of you. All right, thank you very much. Which brings to mind the question, can ESG be measured? What standards exist? And I think I'm going to throw this out to Pam and Betsy now to help us get a little more up to speed on what is out there today.
I'll lead off. So about 90% of companies in the S&P 500 report, on sustainability in some form or another. 70% of those usually use three standards. One is SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Second is TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and others report on GRI. So SASB just merged with the International Integrated Reporting Council to form the Value Reporting Foundation, which will work with 3 other standard setters to try to harmonize the disparate standards that exist. Interestingly, the TCFD, while voluntary in the US, is mandatory in EU, UK, and in Hong Kong. And there is also an EU corporate sustainability reporting directive, which will apply to US public companies that have operations in Europe. So standards, do exist. I think that the SASB standards are pretty interesting because they do provide more consistency around ESG disclosures. The TCFD is more focused on climate-related disclosures, and I think that GRI and others are a little bit more general, with respect to governance. But it will be interesting to see what happens over the next few years as these standard setters work together, and they're also working with the FRS Foundation to try to create global standards that will provide that comparability that is currently lacking for investors.
And is that something our regulators are getting involved in? Are these more self-regulatory organizations? How do you see that coming together?
I mean, well, currently, the standard setters, really are just that. It's not a regulatory mandate as of yet. But I think the interesting question will be, well, what happens, once we do have these harmonized standards? One would think that there may be some regulatory and rulemaking action along with that, to make some of these standards compulsory. But time will tell.
And Barbara, in terms of the investor community, we just saw Blackstone spend, I think, $1 billion through one of their private equity funds acquiring an ESG data and consulting firm. So clearly, a lot of investment is being made. We've been reading Larry Fink's letters, as Pam said, now for several years.
Right.
And got Vanguard and Fidelity. I'm curious as to what you're seeing there as these standard setters emerge.
Well, I think we're probably, I don't know if this is a contrarian view. I think we're probably not close to having standards that in the US that will be completely accepted. I think it's going to continue to be, what are you saying you're doing, and are you doing it? Is going to be the focus of the regulatory environment. But that's just, I mean, I'm from an asset management practitioner point of view. I don't think there'll be the kind of very specific rules that can come out of the EU regarding behaviors. And so that will mean it's really going to be driven by the companies themselves to decide what they're going to commit to and how they're going to measure it and where the data is going to come from. And data is critical. I mean, I'm not surprised BlackRock would invest in their own data source. There are a number of firms that provide what we might call overall third-party ESG scores, but I think those are going to be less and less useful to be rated high by some rating entity in terms of your ESG. You're going to need to have much more granularity, and therefore the access to data, whether it's third-party databases or services, or you, as a manager, you acquire your own or build your own. I'm involved with one entity that's building its own ability to compile data relevant to our organization. So I do think, the standards are going to evolve, but it's going to be, what are you committing to? Are you committing to improvement? Well, then you're going to have to show improvement. Are you committing to an absolute? I mean, Google has said they're going to be 100% carbon-free energy supporting all their operations globally by 2030. So yeah, they've got a pretty clear path. They're not being told to do that. There's no regulatory framework that's saying you got to be. A number of car companies are committing to be 100% electric by a certain date. They then are going to have to show how you're going to get there. I mean, the investors want to see then, how are you going to get there, and how are you measuring? How are you measuring that? And some metrics are easier than others, and I think this is a very wide open space. I don't want to call it the Wild West right now, but I think it's pretty formative. It's evolving, and every company is going to have to invest in how they're going to do it, what third parties, what data sources are going to use and what third parties are going to use, and their feet are going to be held to the fire for these commitments.
Thank you. Betsy, let's move over to talking about culture audits and culture checks. What are some of the issues that have surfaced? And first of all, just what is a culture audit and why do you do them and who do they help? And, tell us a little bit about your world.
Thank you. So the culture check, as I previously briefly mentioned, is a check on the culture, the environment, the ecosystem of a company. And as Barbara had mentioned, there are third parties that will do this. Some of the information is reliable and some of it is not. Our methodology is that we come in through the back door, as we say, which means that we are speaking to former employees, and this is, by the way, typically in the context of an investment, M&A activity, where our client, who is the acquiring company, wants to make sure that they are not buying into a problem, which could, be headlines in the FT, Wall Street Journal, New York Times that would tarnish their brand. So that's the motivation, is to get intelligence which helps them make better decisions. It doesn't necessarily kill the deal. I'll give a few examples. So coming in the back door means that we are discreetly talking to former employees, people in the industry. We certainly don't mention who our client is. We don't use the word investment or acquisition. We keep it, quite vague, so that we can get the information that we want. Obviously, we're being truthful, but we're as vague as we can be. And in doing so, we develop information which is sometimes negative and then sometimes positive. So an example of, I'll start off with the positive, is for household name company. We were looking at a rather medium-sized small startup, and they were very concerned about the bro culture because of so many of the high-profile tech companies that have had some, very toxic environments. And as it turned out, what we learned is that this particular company was known in the industry for hiring female engineers, and that they were trailblazers, if you will, and that it was known as a really great place for women to work. This was news to them, and so it helped them as they were, they went ahead with the acquisition in this case, and they have been using this to attract other people and recognizing that it's really something that they can lead with. So that's on the positive. On the negative, an example is we learned with one company that their former head of sales was regularly taking employees to strip clubs. This employee, the head of sales, had left the company, not because of this, but went on to another startup. And the C-suite, in this case, a group of young men, I'm saying young, they were probably in their late 30s, early 40s. And there was one woman, I might add, there was one woman. They actually didn't do anything about this. It had been brought to their attention. And so to Barbara's point about communication, but they didn't do anything about it. And so it was known in the company that this was tolerated and that the C-suite knew about it and didn't do anything about it. So our client did go ahead with this acquisition with their eyes wide open, immediately put in SOPs. So we're not there to kill the deal, but to help our client understand what pitfalls there might be so that they understand, what's the chatter out there that they should be aware of.
So really, once again, helping to identify risks using the ESG lens?
ESG as well as others. So, which industries do we look at? Financial services, sports, tech, old clunker, Rust Belt, across the board. And in some cases, where the concern is sales practices. and the compliance with, not breaking the law. As we all know, there are financial institutions that have been fined hundreds of millions of dollars for breaking the law. And we are looking not just at ESG, but all issues which could be problematic that would, again, taint the brand.
And are there any industries you found to be more problematic than others?
Not really. It's interesting. The examples that I gave happen to both be tech, but no, I would not say that one industry is more susceptible than others, because on the one hand, the tech, you've all read about the bro culture at some companies, and those same companies are trailblazers when it comes to ESG issues and holding management accountable to a certain standard. So it really is across the board that we're hired, and I would say there's no industry that stands out as being more problematic than others.
Can I jump in, Karen? Can I jump in with a question for Betsy? Betsy, when you think about the challenges confronted by a corporation that wants to look at its own culture, so it's not in an acquisition or M&A model, and you often find sort of defensiveness or entrenched sort of commonly held views. For example, they might say, we do exit interviews so we know why people are leaving, or we do culture surveys and do it ourselves. Can you talk about how one goes about bringing in a third party to do an internal, because I tend to feel as having been a CEO for 17 years that exit interviews didn't give me much information, because frankly, nobody wanted to, except the one or two over the years that wanted to burn the house down. Most don't. Most don't want to burn the bridges behind them. They want good references or positive references. So you don't really get the information from an internally conducted exit interview. Have you had experience in this area, and what advice would you give about doing your own, looking in the mirror?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The prompt to bring us in is usually M&A and or as part of an internal investigation where there's been a trigger because there's been an issue. And then we're coming in the front door and people know why we're there and whatnot. So when we're doing that, part of a larger project that is prompted by a problem, usually, we're bringing to bear our backgrounds and skills as investigative reporters, great researchers who are going to get a lay of the land and not rely on an exit interview, et cetera. But to ask the right questions. And to ask the right questions, you have to do some research so that you almost, go in knowing or expecting a certain answer because of the research that you've done. So we will do that. We're not the firm to come in and do an HR review of the system. That's not us. But we have a wealth of experience in connection with there's been a problem, and now interviews should be conducted for the purpose of understanding where specifically the problems lie, how they were handled, what the communication was, and how to change things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pam, I'm going to have a question for you on ESG audits, but in the meantime, I just want to mention to our audience that we are happy to take questions in a few minutes, and you can enter those on the question tab on your screen. It should be up to the right. Pam, what kinds of ESG audits are being done today? And can you tell us some of the trends?
Yeah, I think if we look at where responsibility lies for the ESG audits, there was a report that came out recently in May of this year by the Institute of Internal Auditors that really, I think, did an effective job of pointing out that ESG is just another risk, and that the internal audit department is extremely well situated to advise the C-suite and to provide assurance, to the board. with respect to ESG policies, procedures, internal controls. And they do it for a whole panoply of other risks. And this is just another risk to be considered in any enterprise-wide risk assessment. There were some specific recommendations on, in particular on, the advisory side, and then on the assurance side. On the advisory side, certainly, I think that internal audit, listen, they're specialists on the control environment. So when it comes to building out, an ESG control environment, what does that look like? I think that they're also well situated to advise on, which metrics to use, and also to be a sounding board for ESG governance. And of course, the trustee COSO internal control structure is, a very good framework, to use to sort of assess and mitigate ESG risks, just like all other enterprise-wide risks. On the assurance side, and I think this is what will become important as the standards, continue to evolve. There are a number of different roles that internal audit can play. One is, reviewing reporting metrics, for relevancy, accuracy, timeliness and consistency. That's what we're hearing is expected, by the Division of Examinations. And that's frankly what is done on a routine basis for financial reporting. So the same skill set can be used and leveraged in the ESG context. Likewise, reviewing the reporting for consistency with the formal financial disclosures to make sure if there's a sustainability report and you've got information in your 10K to make sure there are no conflicts there, and the company's being consistent, across the board with respect to its communications and disclosures. I know that Barbara had talked earlier quite a bit about materiality. That's a place where, internal audit makes assessments every day about what are material risks to the business and how do you mitigate those risks. And then really importantly is starting to incorporate ESG into audit plans. I know that some internal audit departments are doing this. I know our survey said that 15% only we're doing ESG type audits. 72 we're not, 3% we're not sure. But the companies who are doing it do have some formal protocols in place. I think the key though, and this is really a challenge right now, especially in the post-pandemic world, because I think internal audit resources are really strapped. But for those companies who have independent, experienced and well-funded audit departments, they can take on that additional responsibility for auditing internally. In many cases, and this is sort of consistent with the results, I think, where there are so many risks that have arisen in the last 18 months in particular, I think that internal audit departments are really kind of tapped out. So in those instances, that's where outside professionals are being tapped to come in to help with the risk assessment, to help with ESG specific due diligence to see if there are any red flags. I think that Betsy talked about that in a culture context. We also do it globally. Colleagues are doing this in Brazil, looking at climate disclosures. We're doing it in Africa. Other colleagues are working on human rights, violations. We're doing this work in Canada and other locations where there's a need just to have extra arms and legs on the ground, to provide, some additional, assurance around some of the risk areas. And then there's also just the general risk assessment process where pieces of it might be outsourced. And then again, the ultimate is the compliance audit. We are going in and actually actively looking to see, is there compliance with the stated policies and procedures? It's really looking at implementation and effectiveness, just like you would with any other risk area that internal audit tends to, tends to cover within their audit program. So I do think that the internal audit department in particular is well positioned to play an important role to the extent that they have the bandwidth to do that. And to the extent that they don't, there are outside service providers, who are very experienced at conducting the due diligence procedures, the risk assessments, and the compliance audits where there's a need for additional expertise or geographic resources.
Barbara, what are you seeing in terms of the boards, the other boards that you serve on, and as you go out and speak with corporate leaders?
In line really with what Pam is saying, that increasingly the board audit committees are at least inquiring, where are we doing all we should be doing in the ESG audit space? And for those firms in particular that have made voluntary commitments or published sustainability reports, which are not always, they're not regulatory reports, they're frankly, they're a bit more marketing and they're important, but they're not required reports as the financial audits are. And so the audit committees are asking, should we be incorporating this? I'm not sure I can say that there's been a lot of action yet, but I know recently, NACD convened audit chairs of Fortune 500 companies in the spring of 2021, and they all agreed that this will make it to the audit agenda, but they didn't do a survey of saying, is it on there now? So again, this is another one of those areas that is going to just be moving forward, and certainly management would be well advised to be alert to this and maybe be ahead of the curve and not wait for the boards to ask for it, but to assure that they are already suggesting and incorporating ESG audit type factors into the ones that are relevant to them into their both internal and external audit plans.
Thank you. We had a question earlier asking us what will change over the next 5 years in terms of priorities for most businesses pertaining to ESG. I think we've heard today that this can be very specific to an industry or to a company. But if you're looking into your crystal balls, and I'll throw this out to the group, what do you think the 5-year horizon looks like in terms of the priorities that companies will be setting for themselves?
Well, I'll jump in. I know we probably all have something to say on this, but I think we're at the tip of the iceberg on this. I mean, I know it feels like it's a inexorable, huge, but there's so much more that is going to unfold. 3 things. I mean, boards are going to get more educated about this beyond this, the level, and they're going to start asking for more from company managements, more information, more accountability over the next 5 years. Second, we're just coming back to life from COVID-19, and hopefully we'll be able to stay there as things unfold with this really horrifying disease. But we don't know what the workplace is going to look like, and that's very much the social factor. I mean, will there continue to be the opportunity for virtual work, which both helps and hinders caregivers and women in particular? So that workplace factors, which is the big S in ESG, are a big part of the S. And third is the regulatory agenda with the climate change imperative and the very dramatic severity of storms and increase of storms and severe weather, and how that affects company operations, how that drives the climate change agenda and the carbon reduction agenda. That the next 5 years, I don't see that abating. I think that will get, so we've got a number of, I think, key drivers that will not lower the temperature on the ESG dynamism going forward, and the imperative really that management, boards, regulators are all looking at this, and it's just going to increase over time.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I mean, I've said this before, but I mean, just to close on it, I mean, I do think that we're moving toward a convergence of global standards, and I think that I think it's important for companies to stay ahead of that. We know that a lot of U.S. corporations in particular are appointing diversity inclusion officers in response to, to some of the demand. But I think that there needs to be some more broad thinking about the other parts of ESG, and some internal review, of the governance aspects as well, and how that impacts the entire organization. And I think it should be part of the risk assessment. And I think that as we anticipate more regulation, both new standards and more regulatory scrutiny, that companies would be well served to get ahead of it, stay abreast of some of these developments, figure out, what does and what does not apply, to your company, and start moving toward, toward a compliance method, I think, just to get ahead of it and to be prepared, to leverage your internal resources, to do some internal auditing if you can, to kick the tires, to see what you have. You might have more than you think you have, and it may just be that some of the skill sets are in disparate parts of the organization, and it might just be looking internally, see what you have, and then filling any gaps that you need.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add, from the private company point of view, is you're already seeing, for instance, in the state of California, where there's now a requirement to have, depending upon the size of the board and the company, how many female and other minority representation on the board. And in the ecosystem of the venture world and the private equity growth world, more and more entrepreneurs are saying to various firms who have put in a term sheet and want to fund the company, sorry, you're not diverse enough, basically, and we're going with another firm. So and I think over the next 5 years, that is going to, if not become more systematized, I think the free markets will dictate, and you'll see more and more of the firms that are making the investments becoming a lot more diverse for their bottom line reasons, because they want to chase the deals and secure, the deal.
As
I think just to elaborate,
good for business.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, just to elaborate on that, I think some of the detail from the proxy advisors is really interesting. So Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, has announced that starting this year, 2021, they're going to monitor boards of companies in the Russell 3000 and the S&P 1500 indices and flag those with no apparent racial or ethnic diversity. In 2022, they'll recommend voting against nominating committee chairs of boards that lack diversity. And then, Glass Lewis as well, they will vote against non-com chairs that are of all male boards. And starting in 2021, they'll point out boards that have no more than one female director, and in 2022 they'll recommend against nominating committee chairs with less than 2 female directors. So this, boards that have more than 7 directors. So this is changing, and then I think the NASDAQ amendments to the listing standards are relevant here too, because they're requiring companies to enhance their disclosures regarding director diversity, and then they're also requiring companies to have at least 1 female and at least 1 director from either a racially or ethnically diverse background or the LGBTQ community, or explain, right? Comply or explain why the board lacks that diversity on the board. So that's a big change, especially here in the U.S. Certainly, in Europe and in other countries, there have been quotas. We're starting to see some in the U.S., but to have such active statements and aggressive positions by the proxy advisors, and I think by the listing standards, I think it says a lot about how much the landscape has changed. Just to Betsy's point there, and Barbara's earlier point as well.
Which explains why the phone has been ringing a little more lately. I will say that in our experience, most companies still do not use search firms for board members. It's traditionally been very much a network search conducted by the existing board. But now when we do get those calls, the request is very lengthy. And so, you have an entire board, some of whom have been sitting there for even a few decades. And then you have this new director who's being added, and with a dazzling array of qualifications, that they're diverse in more than one way, and bring special skills such as cybersecurity. We'd love to see more on the HR front. Maybe an international business experience, and maybe they're being asked to walk in and share the audit committee on day one. And so there's just, a big ask. And having said that, there are just so many qualified director candidates that I find it very exciting to think we're going to be seeing more of these people entering the boardrooms because of some of this pressure. I don't think any of us really were hoping to have quotas, but as you say, it is in fact making an impact and having a difference. And, maybe will take less than 100 years to get to some more diversity in the boardroom, which was the predicted number several years ago that I read. But I think it's exciting that the conversation is happening on a broader level now. Are there any innovative ESG initiatives that any of you have seen? Who do you see as on the leading edge of this trend of really trying to get out there as a company or as an industry? Clearly, there's been some pressure on some of the companies who have glaring environmental challenges, and other companies who have, shall we say, enjoyed special attention from some activist investors. But are there industry organizations? Someone has asked us a question about whether there are any ESG certification programs that you might recommend or places to look for those. If someone is starting to do their research and wanting to get their company a little further ahead on this journey, do you have some recommendations, really for where people can start?
Well, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Barbara. Nope, after you, Barbara.
That's a great question, and I'm shocked I don't have a good answer for it. I am not aware of a certification program. I know there are a lot of rankings or ratings that are given by different entities, and I don't know if it's MSCI or other entities that offer products that, and Morningstar gives a, gosh, what do they call it? They call it a stewardship grade or something to companies, and so you might look there and see what your stewardship grade is. And they do it for mutual funds, but I believe they also do it for companies. I'm not necessarily a fan, though, of those aggregate. I am more of a fan of assessing what your company prides itself. What are your values? What are you putting forward as your profile to your employees, the public, your customers, within your industry? And are you improving it and living up to it? And that takes a lot of work because you have to do it yourself. In the meantime, I will be thinking while Pam and Betsy are perhaps tackling this question, whether I can think of any specific templates that you can get that would help you get started on it. But go ahead, Pam. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Is there any training for individuals? We've got a little bit of clarification on the question. Certificate programs for business leaders. Again, I think of some of the programs I see at business schools, and I'm not sure I've seen very many yet on the subject of ESG, but maybe some specific components of ESG, such as director trainings.
Yeah, I've seen some director trainings, Karen, and I also have seen some management programs that focus on ESG and in particular, but just like stepping back, big picture, I mean, I would start with, the principles for responsible investing. I mean, this has been driven by the institutional shareholders and by the folks who signed on early, to this whole philosophy of sustainability. And I would just start there because that was really the beginning. And look at how that organization has grown, and look at the signatories to that organization, and how the movement sort of evolved over the years. And for me, maybe because it's the CPA in me, I really like to go to the standards. And I do think that SASB has some excellent standards. I would look at the standards that are in your industry. You can search by industry, and it will lay out a whole set of factors for you to think about. And to the extent that you're in an industry where, you're dealing with, environmental or climate-related disclosures, of course, look at those standards as well. But I think just to get yourself educated and look at what's out there, and then to say, okay, which ones apply to me, to our business, which ones can we ignore for now, and then just looking at, the more general standards, doing your own sort of gap analysis of what your current, policies, procedures, and internal controls are against some of those more general standards to see, hey, what have we done before in our enterprise-wide risk assessment? Where have we done a good job? Where do we really need to, improve or take advantage of the opportunity to enhance some of these functions? And I personally think that would sort of get you up to speed so that you could then go back and look into some of those programs. And I think that some of the programs that I've seen look pretty good. I don't know how well attended they are yet. Again, this is sort of an emerging area. People are still thinking about it. But that's where I would start personally.
Betsy, anything to add? You're on mute.
No, I don't have anything to add to what Pam and Barbara said. Thank you.
Great. In fact, following up on what you just said, Pam, I'm getting a note in the questions that the CFA organization, the Chartered Financial Analysts in the UK, have a certificate now in ESG investing. Thank you.
Good point. I think they have it in the US too. Good. Yeah. That's a good pickup. Yep.
So, Pam, we had a question earlier. What were the 3 common ways of measuring ESG that maybe you mentioned earlier in the conversation? Does that ring a bell? And you're on mute.
So, from an internal audit perspective?
Possibly.
So just in terms of measuring, so it's looking at the accuracy of whatever disclosures are out there. So I think one of the challenges, and I think this is where the risk alert from the Division of Examinations is particularly good, because what they do is they conduct exams on a regular basis. They do it on different types of topics, but they're doing ESG specific reviews and examinations right now. And some of the places, where companies fell short is that, they said they had, one particular ESG strategy, but yet in practice, there was nothing to sort of support the strategy that they purported to follow. So that was one big criticism. So the fix for that is to make sure that, if you've got a policy out there, whatever you're saying about your ESG posture, that you have that documented someplace, that you can show this is what you're in fact doing. If you say, you're only investing in companies, that have their own, ESG policies and follow them, but yet you do nothing to check and see if they in fact are doing anything at all, then that's a problem. On the other hand, companies who say, hey, we are following, pick your framework, SASB framework, and also have some internal documentations to support that they have the framework. Or maybe they're saying, hey, this is voluntary, and we endeavor to follow this framework, but you're being transparent about it, and you have some support internally, to show, what you're in fact doing. So that it sort of goes back to, you can have the best policies and procedures in the world, but if they're not implemented and operating effectively, they really don't matter. right? So having someone like internal audit or an assurance function go in and say, okay, we have this, ESG policy. Are we following it? Whatever the issue is, if it's a social issue, if it's a climate issue, if it's a diversity issue, if it's a governance issue, have we in fact implemented it? Do people know about it? What are we doing about it? What evidence do we have of implementation? Is it operating effectively? If we look to see if internal controls are such that the policies that are articulated are really being followed, then that's a great thing. So I think it's one, assessing the accuracy, 2, testing for implementation, and 3, having some assurance around operating effectiveness, I think are important.
I'm going to ask our panelists if they have any final thoughts to share with us, but wanted to mention quickly that we have shared a resource with you which has some backup material for some of the comments that have been made today, and we will be sending that out to you in a follow-up email. And there will also be an edited recording of this session made available. I know some people had to leave early and maybe were not able to attend, so we'll be sharing that as well. We'll start with Betsy, if you'd like to share with us any final thoughts, just, given the rich universe of companies that you've had the opportunity to work with, maybe something a little bit encouraging for our audience about how assessing culture, whether or not one brings in an outside firm, but just, what value that can bring not only to a transaction, but, to a company in its everyday operations. I'd love for you to share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Karen. So I would just say that, in our world, we feel that information empowers you, and it empowers you to make decisions. And given what we've discussed in the last hour plus about, attracting talent, doing the right thing, avoiding, dips in revenue and boycotts and whatnot, most of that can be managed. Again, not all, but most of that can be managed by having a really good sense of the health of your culture. As Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast every time. There's a lot to be said for that. I'm not sure of the current stat on how many M&A deals fail, and often it's because of culture. So going in with your eyes wide open does require some additional looking, even if it's to confirm what you already knew. Often you gain a little bit of information or a lot of information which can really assist you in making the strategic decisions.
Thank you. Barbara, would you like to share a few thoughts with us?
I guess I have the gray hair, although it doesn't look that way, in the group, and having been working in this landscape now for 24 years plus. And I think the notion that, doing good is actually good for business has just matured to a very great extent. And certainly younger generations pushing for that has helped. But also the realization that corporations have a huge footprint in society and on the planet, and can be are not neutral parties. And I think it's just so encouraging. I am not a fan of regulation. I'm very much a fan of voluntary efforts and voluntary programs. And I think we've seen an awful lot of that voluntary action unfolding, and it's very encouraging to me, and I'm hopeful that it will continue, and that with the use of sort of additional resources and tools to improve corporate behaviors and the role of boards and really stepping up as well, that managements we're going to see our corporate sector be a very positive citizen in this country and on the planet by making improvements in the areas of ES and G.
Thank you. Pam, a few words to share with us?
Just a few. I guess I'll change course just a little bit and say, while I've spoken today quite a lot about, the impending regulation and the converging standards, I think you do have time to figure this out. One of the challenges, though, again, is just going back to the resources and just looking internally to say, hey, do we have the right people? You have time, but it's also a good time to reflect on, what you have, where the gaps are, and how you want to fill the gaps so that you're positioned to succeed going forward on the ESG front.
Thanks very much. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge and insights with us today, and thank all of you for joining us on this most timely topic. We hope that you'll come away with some new perspectives and ideas on how to use ESG culture and risk assessments to your advantage. Most of all, I hope that we've helped you to understand that ESG is the business of everybody in the organization rather than simply a board committee, although it might start there, or a single executive, or the investor relations VP or the general counsel. And you don't have to start from scratch. There are resources available, news coming out every day. Once you start paying attention to this topic, it's unavoidable. And we will be sharing those resources with you. And we will make this also available on LinkedIn. So thanks, everyone. We are closing the session now.